Good morning, good morning, good morning. Well, I suppose it's the afternoon, and holy hell, that's annoying. One second. Let me actually just, you know what? We're gonna go through, we're gonna turn those random cockpit noises off. I fucking hate that shit. ATC, turn it off. Cockpit ambiance. Turn it off. Alright, we're good there. So, based on that sound, you may have noticed we are not loading into the Mercury capsule immediately. There's a good reason for that. And I'll definitely go over why that is definitely a thing. So we are loaded. In the actual fictional spacecraft, Delta Glider. And the reason I'm loaded into the spacecraft is because it provides a really, really, really good picture here of what's actually going on as we're flying in orbit and inserting into orbit. And the cabin ambiance is still going, a son of a bitch. 1 second. I swear to God. Sound config. I have play random cabin ambience disabled. Play radio sound and attitude mode. Sounds of space. Yep. No ATC when grounded. So that looks good. Let me just verify if I'm using a different sound mod. Nope. Okay. Fine. Well, I guess we'll just have to deal with it then. Fine. Oh, for sure. And thank you for stopping by, NCAT. I have not spoken to you in a long time. Dude, I miss you. But I'm super busy. I've got... God damn the cabin ambience. I am going to disable the sound mod if this gets too annoying. But, yeah, no, I've got 2 jobs. I've got Capstone, and this is a bit of a spontaneous stream anyways, and the only reason I'm doing this is because I want to cry from Capstone class today, so I'm doing a stream instead. So, yeah, yeah. If you're wondering, the reason is because the class voted our presentation as not ready to move on to the final portion of the class, so we would have had to actually restart the class. But I spoke with the professor after class about that, and he said that we did fine, and he's overriding it. And that it was either a misunderstanding of what the vote actually meant, or that the class lacked maturation enough to know what the tech industry is looking for. So I almost failed capstone today. So yeah. Let's talk about orbital mechanics instead. The reason I'm loaded up into the Delta Glider instead of the Mercury capsule is because of specifically this display right here, which spacecraft prior to like 1980 don't have. And I really, really like this display to show you how orbital mechanics actually works. So we are going to project... let's project like this, that's fine. So we are going to do a very simple liftoff, and let's just observe what's happening while we inject into orbit. So let's punch in P904, spec 42, and let's just get underway. And let's observe what the spacecraft does.
Ascend.
So right now, it's actually just going to do its vertical takeoff. But let's take a look.
Engaging turbo pump.
So here we can see we're on the surface and we're kicking up now. And so let's take a look and let's watch this ascent. And let's note what we're observing. Look at this. So this view is from the equatorial plane, and this view is in reference to our ship. Let's do reference to the ship for now, just because it makes it more obvious that we're not smacked into the surface. But here is our orbit as it stands. And the reason it looks like this is because all orbits are measured from the center of the Earth. And that Earth is slightly rotating, so we're coming along basically doing this while the Earth rotates, right? So that's why the orbit looks like that. It's not particularly helpful when you're suborbital and this low to the ground, but we'll just take a look and we'll observe the behavior of this circle. And we'll also observe the behavior of our ground path. And we can actually zoom in a bit. And we can see our ground path is basically nothing right now. Which makes sense, because we are, ascending. But you can see sort of the first part of this is to go up. And almost straight up. So there's two components to getting into orbit. And they're very simple. It's go high and go fast. So right now, we can see we're not moving very fast at all. We're moving, our actual speed is Mach 1.8, but relative to the ground, we are not pushing anything. And that's okay, because we're achieving altitude. When we get high enough, we're going to do something called a gravity turn, in which we'll point toward the horizon. And wow, I could not have timed that any better. That was actually completely unintentional timing. But now we're going to start achieving the going fast part. So as we're pitching over, take a look at how this circle is expanding now. So now it's not just updating our position, but it's also telling us in the future we're going to be going a little bit more sideways. And as we get further away from the Earth, we'll see that this circle shrinks down. Also realized I forgot to pull up stream chat, so let me do that. It's probably people asking questions, and I have no idea. So yeah, no, I did not almost fail capstone. It's just that the class voted for us to fail capstone, which is completely bullshit. Honestly, even if I thought that someone didn't have a pitch good enough or a project good enough, I wouldn't have voted for them to fail the class. I would have told the professor in private my concerns so that they could work on it for their FP&P. But, so I think that was rather unsportsmanlike, if you ask me. So that's just a clarification. But here we are, we can see, look at that, we are above the surface now by a noticeable amount. And take a look, that circle ever expanding as we're picking up orbital speed. So we can see our altitude, we can see our speed, and take a look, here's our orbital eccentricity. I can pull up that same information here. And let's do EST. So we can see our apoapsis and our periapsis altitude. Right now, periapsis is still in the ground. Eccentricity is 0.9, and of course, as we achieve a more stable orbit, that's going to fix itself. But also take a look. Our inclination, our inclination is rising. We punched in an inclination of 42. However, we are not on terminal guidance yet, so that's something to be considered. Rockets follow just this very basic path, and right before shutoff, then the computer on the rocket will take control, and it will make those corrections. So we'll talk about what those are. But we can see from the point we lifted off from, pretty much right here, we've moved a lot, and our orbit has moved with us. Here we have our anode and our denode, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. We're going to briefly cover all of the different types of attitudes and their effects on orbit when you burn in those attitudes. We're not going to talk about how we can string them together into a rendezvous yet, or into orbital course corrections yet. It's not something we're going to touch on. I just want to show you guys what those types of maneuvers look like and how they affect the orbit, so that as you're going through your ascent in Mercury, you can, with 100% certainty, say, hey, the missile is doing something that it should not be doing, abort. Because I do see a lot of people that when the missile starts to pitch, when it starts to yaw, they're like, oh my god, this looks crazy, I need to abort. When I know that they should not abort, or they should not have worry in what the missile is doing. So we'll go over, we're just taking a look at orbit, observing what it's doing, looking at that circle expand as we pick up speed, looking at that periapsis altitude come up, looking at our inclination, and you'll see the types of maneuvers. We're going to insert into a damn near 42-degree inclination orbit perfectly. Okay? So this is a guarantee. So all the maneuvers here are completely nominal, and we can reference them with our Atlas missile a little bit later. Thank you, NCAT, and have a great day at work. I hope that goes well. I was just at work yesterday for 6 hours, and we had a major incident, and it sucked. Yeah, one of the email accounts got breached, but it wasn't that big of an issue. It's nothing I can talk about past that, but yeah, it did suck, but it did not suck that bad. If that makes any sense. Here we go. Predictive correction. Take a look at what the spacecraft is doing now at this point. We can see it's pitching further down, and take a look at our orbit as well. See how now we're up and we have this sort of trajectory. We're still going to come in, but look at that. Our trajectory is not just pointing straight down. We actually have air time now, so it's something to look out for. And so our pitch, we're pitching down because we want to speed up. We want to speed up the growth of our periapsis here. So here's our apoapsis, here's our periapsis. So we're pitching down to speed up the growth of our periapsis. Here's our orbit relative to the equator, or the equatorial plane, if you will. Now take a look. We're pitching up now because we need to make this apoapsis higher. And now we're beginning our final correction. There we go. Insertion.
Ascent completed. All parameters nominal.
So take a look at our orbit, and we can see, look at that. We are damn near on that 42 mark, right with almost the same plane as the ISS. So at this point, I'm just going to run the final checks for the spacecraft. You don't need to pay attention to this part. But just so that we can take a look at some of the different maneuvers. Okay, checklist end. Alright, so we are in our stable orbit. Now let's display, instead of ground track, we will modify to orbital plane. So the first type of maneuver I want to cover is a prograde and retrograde burn. So prograde, what that's going to do is, let's just drift around. And we can see we have a little bit of orbital perturbations due to non-spherical gravity, but that's okay. Let's go prograde. Alright, so taking a look at this. Take a look at this orbit circle here, and watch what happens when we burn prograde. So we burnt prograde at our retrograde mark. You'll notice, look at that, periapsis and apoapsis have switched places. And now take a look. So we maintain the same altitude here. We maintain the same altitude here, but notice how the altitude on the other side of the orbit, notice how that is much, much, much higher now. Right? So notice how we're drifting further and further away. But that affected the opposite side of the orbit. Right? Us going up, that had nothing to do, like us burning the direction that makes us go faster and higher, had nothing to do with our side of the orbit, and instead it had everything to do with the opposite side of the orbit. So let's say we want to circularize. We need to burn prograde at this mark, at our apoapsis, and now we bring the opposite side of the orbit up, and we can tell when we are circularized because the icons here will start to shift around. Take a look at that. The apoapsis chases away from us, so now we're completely circularized. We take a look. Our apoapsis and periapsis altitude are within 0.001 megameters of each other. So what does burning retrograde do? Let's burn retrograde at our periapsis mark so that we can see what that will do to the orbit. So we are nearing our retrograde mark here, or sorry, our periapsis mark here, so we will orient retrograde. And now take a look at what happens when we burn here. We're going to burn forward, but we are facing 180 degrees around from where we were before. Take a look at how the other side of the orbit shrinks, and also how now our new apoapsis is where we currently are in the orbit. So take a look at that. Let's do one full orbit, and let's take a look at some of the weird things we can do. Let's say we want to burn. And what happens if we burn pointed right at the Earth, right? So let's engage.
Translation, rotation.
And let's point right at that good old Earth. Which should be somewhere close by. Actually, here, what we could do is we can go level horizon. Actually, you know what? I changed my mind. We're going to do this on a day side. Makes it a whole lot easier. So let's go to the day side. Here we go. So we are on the day side now. And let's just... Oops. Do not use the hover engines, please. Alright, let's just point towards the Earth. Right at the center. So in order to help with that, we'll get our HUD power on. There we go. And we'll point directly at the center of the Earth. This is called radial in. Okay? This is called radial in. And take a look at what happens. Look at how we're shifting our orbits. Notice how that orbit, it almost appears as if it's sort of rotating on us. Okay? Now let's do the opposite thing. And burn radial out. Notice how the orbit is, again, it looks like it's rotating back to where it was before. So what are we doing when we do this? When we burn towards the Earth, we're decreasing our current altitude by literally just burning towards the Earth. So we're decreasing the current altitude, but we're also increasing the altitude on the other side of the orbit. So that is something to keep in mind. When you burn towards the Earth, you decrease the altitude over here, and you increase the altitude over here. And so the entire orbit looks like it's rotating because, in fact, it's actually shifting in this direction. It's the whole orbit is moving away from the epicenter of the Earth and shifting up. This is a very, very rare type of maneuver. You'll see it only during the ascent when you'll yaw, so that you can keep your apoapsis from increasing while also increasing your periapsis. So now we're going to go over orbital inclination changes. Orbital inclinations are most effective at your ascending and descending nodes. Here we have our ascending node because we're approaching the high point, and here we have the descending node because we're approaching the low point. When we burn in a nominal direction, plus or minus, take a look at what happens. Let's project with the equatorial plane and take a look. Look at how the entire orbit is shifting, and look at what happens to our orbital plane relative to the ISS. This is called an inclination change. And if we do it in the other direction, we can see that orbital inclination change, and we can bring it back to match that of the ISS. So these are our four basic, or our 8 basic maneuvers. Prograde, retrograde, nominal plus, nominal minus, radial in, and radial out. Just remember, whatever you do with prograde and retrograde, affect the opposite side of the orbit. Whatever you do with radial in and radial out, affect both sides of the orbit. And nominal plus and nominal minus can be used for inclination changing. The reason these can be used is because you're burning perpendicular to the plane of your orbit. So with that, you are burning, let's say at this point, you're burning straight upwards. So you're moving your velocity up, going in this direction, and down, going in the other direction. And minus, you burn down. So you're moving this velocity down, and this velocity up. And this is why you change your inclination. So that is the basic orbital maneuver types. So now we'll switch over to reentry, and we'll do a Mercury ascent. And we'll talk about what we notice there. So I'm just gonna pull up. Oh, an update on reentry. I should have checked that first, but it's just a hot fix, so it's gonna take 2 seconds. That's for some graphics and bugs. Yeah, yep. Wish the flickering would stop, though. I haven't seen the flickering. I don't know what you guys are talking about with the flickering. Genuinely, I think it might be an AMD issue. Because no one with an NVIDIA, at least to my knowledge, has got a flickering issue.
If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be determined.
Yeah, we're about to get copyrighted from the song, so we're just gonna mash the escape button to get past that. Rebel stream yesterday, it showed up. Interesting. Updates to default checklists. Yeah, we'll install. Actually, I have not been on reentry in a long time, so let me just quickly review what exactly they did to the update. Oh, SPS Burn Planner in VR, nice. Mercury and Gemini Academy overhaul. Atmospheric rendering. Strange artifacts. We do, ooh, yes, the Gemini Rendezvous Optics site. The ROS. It's like a COAS, that's nice. Modified Core 19 to show as minute, 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 second, second. Finally. Took it a long time to get there, but that is the actual behavior of the computer, so I'm very happy they did that. External illumination on the cockpit, very nice. GD3 was added with the scroll, nice. The famous corned beef sandwich brought by John Young has been added. Very nice, very nice. It's just small improvements like this. We're trekking along very nicely to 1.0, honestly. In its current position, if we get this same tweaking with Apollo next, then I think, honestly, I would say we're decently ready for 1.0. But that's just me. Let's get into the Mercury. We're not going to do the cold and dark, since I've already done that last stream. We'll just do the Atlas Ascent. Alright, we are in. T-minus 5 minutes. Let's take a look. Launch control switch ready. UHF, high power. DC volts to 1. ARM, squibs, and auto retro. So with this new configuration, we're going to have some additional checklists to do during our ascent. At BECO, or Booster's Engine Cutoff, we're just going to have to click off a few circuit breakers. And then at Orbital Insertion, we're just going to have to click off another few circuit breakers. So those are going to be the only new procedures covered. But mostly this is focusing on what do we observe during launch. Let's watch that launch again. Let's take a look at what we observed. Yes, I do notice a slight bit of flickering there, but that is, I believe that comes from the photo camera. I'm 99% sure that comes from the photo camera, and that we'll see that right when we lift off.
Roger, the clock is operating.
Yep, there's the photo camera. You can see it's taking pictures.
Programming and roll okay. A little bumpy along about here.
Yeah, so that's just a little thing. The photo camera.
Roger. 2, 1, mark.
The photo camera is liking to activate under time acceleration for whatever reason. But that's where that flickering is coming from. So again, you know, we don't have a nice orbit display, but we can infer what's happening as we're ascending. Just, yep, wanted to make sure I selected the correct vehicle, and that I did. But yeah, we can infer what's happening. Again, look at that. We're ascending, we're going high, and at the same time, we can see our pitch rate. We're doing a little bit of our gravity turn, so that we can go high, but also sideways really fast. And 2 components of orbit, high and sideways really fast. Let's queue up our BECO checklist, and it's already queued up. Stand by for BECO. Here, let's just switch over to the isolated battery so we can see something pretty cool. Hopefully. Yep, there we go. Uh-huh. Let's see that tower fire off.
Jettison tower is
Jettison tower. That is supposed to make that jump up. Don't know why it doesn't. I'll have to send that in. But retrojet off. Emergency retrojet off. And auto retrojet off. Auto retrojet, for clarification, this does not mean automatically firing your retros. This means automatically jettisoning your retros. Auto retro fire is initiated by retro sequence. The only way that you can turn off the auto retro fire is by turning off the retro sequence. So keep that in mind. Let's take a look. As soon as we see that level horizon, we are going to be initiating terminal guidance. And we are level to that horizon. So we are on terminal guidance at this time. And if we do, approach the window, we should be able to see the Earth through there. A little too high. But take a look. The spacecraft is also yawing slightly. Based on our orbital mechanics discussion, why might the spacecraft have a little bit of yaw? What is yawing doing for our orbit? When we yaw, we are turning ourselves to be slightly more towards a perpendicular mark of our orbit. What does burning perpendicular do? Why are we doing this? Pitching up and pitching down. Interesting.
Rico. Plasma grenades fired. Okay. I just have.
So that's orbital insertion, and as soon as the turnaround has stopped, run our orbit checklist, switch back to monitoring the main bus, landing bag switch off, emergency retro sequence fuse off, emergency drogue deploy fuse off. And that's it. So we are now officially in orbit. So again, we did talk about manually controlling the spacecraft and everything, but let's talk about Mercury's retrograde orientation. So you'll notice retro here is marked, and it is marked with that same attitude with the scope. However, this is not retrograde when you're orbital. This is not. Right? This is very clearly the retro burn that was done at the suborbital trajectory. Because take a look at this. This is damn near radial in. Why would we burn radial in for a retrograde burn? So this is very obviously for the suborbital, and so is the retro optics alignment site. Here, look at this. We are facing retrograde completely now. So that's good. Retrograde completely is at 0 pitch, 0 roll, and 0 yaw, like so. And if you take a look, we can see in the scope, a very quick and dirty way of doing this is making sure that the land tracks in the correct direction and that the horizon hugs the horizon tick here. And again, if we face the other direction and we make the horizon hug the horizon tick, this is the retro indicator for our suborbital trajectory. Now, I could be wrong about this. This could be the retro attitude for orbital as well. However, to me, it literally just does not make any sense because it's too much radial in. Too much. This makes more sense to me. Take a look. Land tracks. Horizon's hugging it. And boosters are pointed in the retrograde direction. My professional opinion, though, definitely gonna have to ask Petrie about that, but I think the retro marks for suborbital. Well, let's skip time. And let's just cover the retrograde. Because it is the same as a suborbital, but the attitude is slightly different. So we'll cover that burn. And everything else should be the same. Yeah, I know that the scope in the future is going to have like different mounting options and different positions it can go into. So I do genuinely think right now that this is the retro orientation for suborbital. Same with this, and this is the retro orientation for orbital. So when you're in orbit, you're just going to drift along to that 30-minute mark. And once you're down to that 30-minute mark, click all these up to 7. So it's super cold. Take a look at the systems and how they adjust there. Super duper cold. Now we can start. 15 minutes prior to that, we'll get some circuit breakers plugged in for the retro burn. So here we go, 15 minutes prior. Emergency retro sequence fuse enabled. Retro rockets 1, 2, 3. Emergency retro jettison fuse enable. The ASCS fuses are on. Periscope fuse, command receiver, telemetry high frequency. Squibs are armed. Auto retrojet is disarmed. Telemetry low is on. UHF continuous. Retro jettison fuse is off. Retro manual fuse is on. Attitude select retro and switch on our autopilot. Same as before, 5 minutes retrograde light. Retro sequence, in retro attitude, and retro fire. I did accidentally time skip a little bit into that, but this is normally delayed by 20 or so seconds. Okay, so everything is done. Now that the burn is complete, we can arm the auto retrojet and turn on the retrojet circuit breakers. And verify emergency retrojet is also on. And now we just wait. Do not orient into re-entry attitude before jettisoning the retro pack. It could come back and smack into you. Jettison it at retro attitude, then orient to re-entry attitude, so that when you hit the atmosphere, you've jettisoned that and you've given it a little bit of more retro, so it hits the atmosphere before you and flies past you. If you jettison it in this same attitude, you're jettisoning it in the path that you're going to be moving, and when it hits the atmosphere first, it may fly back and smack into your heat shield. Not simulated in the simulator, but we like to keep things accurate here. Do not switch to re-entry attitude prior to retro pack jettison. Yep, you can see here, look at that. It got inserted into a slightly higher orbit. And when it hits entry interface, it will fly past us. Because it will hit it theoretically first. But I think in re-entry, these just coast off in a singular direction and go forever. Yeah, not true in the real life. So just something to keep in mind. Here we go. We've got that 0.05 G. And we have initiated the roll. So at this point, we have our entry interface. And we're looking at our ROD, our rate of descent here. And we're coming down. I think possibly in the next video, we're going to talk about re-entry dynamics. I already have a pretty good video on the re-entry dynamics for the spacecraft, but it was with the old and very quiet microphone. So I'm probably going to redo that. Talking about the re-entry dynamics, we're probably not going to go into the spacecraft, just because I feel like that'd be a waste. We've seen 2 re-entries now, including this one, so we get the gist. So I will talk about the dynamics, just probably using MS Paint. And that's probably not going to be a stream then. It'll probably be like a 15 or 20 minute video. And then after that, that wraps it up for Mercury, honestly. The last thing we need to do is talk about equipment failures, and we are ready to move into Gemini. Just think about that for a second. Ready to move into Gemini. And we've already covered everything in terms of getting into orbit, and we've covered the basic orbital maneuvers and their different types. So we don't need to cover those. All we need to cover are all the systems, and right after that, how to rendezvous, and after that, how to re-enter. And we've already talked about re-entry dynamics. We haven't talked about it with a lift vector though, so that will be new. But that's it, you know, like, then we move straight into Apollo. So the Mercury is probably going to be our longest series comparatively. And I really hope Rebel watches these videos. So I hope he finds these helpful. Yeah, a lot of new players don't grasp that making a maneuver in space is almost always affecting the opposite side of your orbit. Unless you're doing an inclination change, then it affects the 90-degree mark of your orbit. But that the other way around, 180 degrees opposite of you, is pretty much always what the orbit affects. It affects the future, not the present. And that's something that people really have to understand. When we burn retrograde, we're not decreasing our current altitude. We're decreasing our future altitude. It's very, very hard for people to grasp. And another concept that's going to be extremely hard to grasp that I will probably end up having to show off in Orbiter is why moving a slower speed in orbit means that you're actually moving faster than another object in orbit. Absolutely crazy concept to explain that slower speed actually equals faster speed while in orbit, but I think I have a nice demonstration to prove that, actually. Yeah, I think I've got a really nice demonstration to prove that. The old marble and funnel demonstration you see in physics class. So yeah, you may be wondering, why are we not arming the emergency drogue deploy circuit breaker / fuse yet? And the answer is, take a look at our ROD. We're in the red, first of all. And secondly, we are not on altimeter. If we arm this right now and we have an equipment failure that causes that drogue to deploy, our main chute is fucked because it is deployed by that retro chute. And there is no reserve drogue There is no reserve drogue. There is only a reserve main. So if we lose that drogue, we're dead. That is why we do not have that circuit breaker armed until we are acquired on barometric altimeter. But here we go. ROD is coming down. We're performing atmospheric braking very nicely. Also, fun fact, SpaceX caught the booster. It caught the booster. Probably should have opened with that, to be honest. That's a little bit of news. Unfortunately, I was not awake while it was happening, so... Here we go, low atmosphere now. We are on our barometric altimeter. The flames are gone. So now that all the heat is done, it is safe at this point to turn on that circuit breaker. Yeah, no, it was happening at like 3 a.m. There was no way I was waking up early for that. I'm sorry. So, yeah, those are the only procedural differences for orbit versus suborbital. So I think once we get our drogue out, I think we're going to stop it there. There goes the drogue. And here comes the snorkel. And entry landing checks complete. Peroxide dumped. Landing bag is out. So, let's do some review. Let us do some review. Yes, I know I won't get credited for the time, but I'm already level 16 or so. I don't need the extra time. So, just to recap, yeah? Let's pretend that's a circular orbit. Actually, I think we could do that better. Let's pretend that's a circular orbit. All right. Oops. There we go. That's looking pretty circular. Okay. So, just to remember, right? Let's say we're traveling this direction. So that's our direction of travel. Burning prograde increases the future altitude 180 degrees opposite of our current point in said orbit. All right. Burning retrograde decreases the future part of the orbit 180 degrees opposite. Notice how that orbit math can check out beneath the surface of the Earth. So we'll have entry interface probably about right here, and here's our landing point. And that landing point, due to atmospheric braking, is going to come up more in this direction, but we'll talk about that in entry dynamics. But notice how you can cause your quote-unquote orbit to where the sphere of your orbit is going through the surface of the Earth. So the math is always the same regardless of if your orbit is going to cause you to smack into the surface or not. So just a thing to point out. If you burn towards the epicenter of your orbit, aka radial in, instead, you shift your entire orbit. So you'll shift the epicenter of your orbit like so. So before, the epicenter was here at the center of the Earth. And now take a look. Now our new epicenter is down here, not at the center of the Earth. All we've done is shift the orbit. So that's what that does. Burning radial out does the other thing in the opposite direction. Let's say we are burning perpendicular to the orbit. Yeah? Perpendicular. Now what we're doing is we're raising this part to go up and this part to go down. So our new orbit is going to instead look like this. Notice we are not intersecting the surface of the Earth here. Okay? So that's a review of the orbital mechanics. And now we'll review last time's homework. So last time's homework, I'm just going to navigate to that. The questions were: number 1, which bus powers the explosive devices? And that is going to be the isolated battery bus. Number 2, what are the squibs used for? They're little explosive devices. They're used for staging the rocket, staging the capsule, controlling those non-revocable items, as we talked about. What is the stack of lights on the left called? This is called in the Mercury capsule, it is called the programmer. It is also called the phase shifter. Remember, the phase shifter controls the next event. The programmer programs in the current event. Reentry likes to call it the sequencer, and that's also what I like to call it because it just makes more sense. It's called the sequence control system in Apollo. It's called the sequencer in Gemini. Mercury, it never really got an official name outside of the 2 circuit breakers that correspond to it, so we'll just call it the sequencer. So we'll take either of those, phase shifter, programmer, or sequencer. Which fuses do not have a secondary fuse in the number 2 position? And those are going to be emergency separation capsule control, tower separation control, emergency retrosequence control, emergency drogue deploy, emergency main deploy, emergency reserve deploy, emergency landing bag, and emergency rescue aids. Why do those fuses not have a secondary fuse in the number 2 position? And that is because if there is an electrical fault and the fuse is blown, those systems are required, their minimum requirements to bring the astronaut home alive. So those systems need to remain powered even in the event of some kind of overvolt or electrical problem. So it uses just a piece of metal called a solid conductor. The manual calls it a solid conductor. That's just fancy for a piece of fucking metal. And that maintains the electrical contact so that system can be deployed and used even if the electrical power fails. So you want those circuit breakers in, and let's say the electrical system fails, it doesn't auto-deploy, you can still manually deploy that system with the number 2 fuse. Well, number 2 fuse in sarcasm quotes, because it is not a secondary fuse, it is a solid conductor, aka a piece of fucking metal. Number 6, what 2 systems use AC power? Fans, because fans always use AC power. They need the different phases wired in different locations on the motor to give that fan the momentum to go forward. When it reaches a spot, the next phase in the motor will pull the fan blades to the next slot. So it's always about that future movement with those fans. That's why it requires AC power, because it needs all 3 phases to keep the rotation going. There are DC motors, but they're just a slightly bit more complicated, like you'd expect in an RC car. Definitely not something you would use in a spacecraft, though. Extremely unreliable. Which of the RCS independent systems can use high-power jets? That is, the auto system uses those high-power jets. Manual uses the low-power jets. Fly-by-wire draws from that auto system, and that uses the high-power jets. But that is typically saved for reentry only. Which of the O2 tanks has a slightly higher pressure? That would be the primary tank. Remember, it's slightly higher pressure so that the system can arrange itself such that it automatically draws from the secondary tank when the primary runs out of pressure. Why can the spacecraft not reject its own heat before reaching high altitude? Remember, this is because we're using a process called sublimation. This is a pressure-dependent sublimation process. Because we don't have the vacuum, we cannot change the boiling point of water such that it evaporates instantaneously, like with the process of sublimation. So, on the ground, the spacecraft cannot reject its own heat and needs to be on a ground coolant supply. Why is the spacecraft pressurized to 16 psi before launch? That is because the spacecraft derives its structural integrity from the pressure contained within itself. Much like a soda can. Really hard to crush a soda can before you open the lid. Quite easy afterwards. And that capsule needs to remain structurally intact, while it's on the ground, while it's getting into orbit. Otherwise, you're going to be having a very rough time when you get to space. What is the purpose of the snorkel? That lets in fresh air. It makes sure that as you're coming down, the cabin doesn't depressurize. It equalizes the internal and the external pressure. Have you ever brought a Pringles can onto an airplane, equalized it with that high altitude pressure, closed the can, and then as it's coming down, the Pringles can explodes? That's what would happen to the spacecraft if there was no snorkel. It's extremely important. What system turns DC power into AC power? That will be the AC inverters. The DC to AC inverters, which we just call AC inverters. That is a function generator, which overlays a function on top of the DC component voltage so that you get alternating current. What system is responsible for controlling pressure, removing CO2 odors, and controlling temperature? That is the environmental control system. How many orbits can the capsule stay in space? And for how many of those orbits will life support be able to go through? It's actually a trick question. The capsule will undergo total orbital decay after 7 orbits. However, there is enough life support for 20 orbits. So a little bit of a trick question there. Trick question. Caught you off guard. What does the maneuver switch do? This one's kind of a misnomer. The maneuver switch has nothing to do with maneuvering the spacecraft itself, and everything to do with the measurement of the attitude. That spins up the little gyros so that the spacecraft can measure its own attitude. And the last question, or number 16, not the last question, what does the pressure regulator handle do? That's the water seal. It prevents a capsule from flooding by taking in water through that pressure regulator. Bonus question. Why must a standby and isolated battery buses be tied to the main bus before going to full internal power? That is because the power umbilical charges the main bus. So you need everything hooked up to the main bus in order for all those batteries to charge on the ground. And what fuel does the RCS system use? The RCS system uses hydrogen peroxide as fuel. So, that covers that. New homework questions. Number 1. Explain the effects of a prograde burn. Number 2. Explain the effects of a retrograde burn. Number 3. Explain the effects of a nominal plus burn. Number 4. Explain the effects of a nominal minus or antinominal burn. Number 5. Explain the effects of a radial in burn. And also, I call them nominal. They're called normal. Normal and anti-normal. I'll fix that in the comments. I don't know why I said nominal. And number 6. Explain the effects of a radial out burn. Number 7. Why does the spacecraft slowly pitch towards the horizon? Number 8, very related to number 7. This is, what are the 2 components required to reach orbit. Number 9. Why does the spacecraft keep pitching up and down and yawing left and right during terminal guidance? Number 10. Explain those effects of pitching and yawing during terminal guidance. All right, those are all our questions. So, yep, just a correction. It is normal plus and normal minus, or normal and anti-normal. So just a small correction there. Nominal, I don't know why. It was just a Freudian slip, I guess, that I just never noticed. But yeah, that's it. Like I said, pretty short stream today. And by short, I mean it is longer than the other one, and I wanted to keep these under an hour. God damn it. Like, spacecraft are complicated, I'm sorry, and these videos are only going to get longer, so... sorry about that. Anyways, have a good one. Thanks for stopping by.